Good morning. Welcome to the first of the Adult Faith Formation program year. We're so glad to have this kickoff, and we always appreciate those of you who come and lean in to learn about the faith tradition and scripture and all sorts of great things. And we're so fortunate to have great teachers within this congregation, and great teachers who are open-hearted and willing to join us at Montview Church from not only the area of Denver, Greater Denver, but we're going to have someone zoom in from another place in the world, so we're very fortunate. This series is called The Art of Lament and of Grief, of lament, grief, and hope. And the reason that we're doing this series called The Art of Lament, it came out of the book study on the Heart of Democracy, Healing the Heart of Democracy by Parker Palmer. Many of you were involved in that book group last summer. And this theme about lamentation, about lament and complaint, kept coming up in the study, and we started talking about what is it to have a resilient faith? What is it to have a healed heart, healing the heart of democracy? What does it take? Is it more than just learning to talk civilly to one another, to talk across the divide, as we've been talking about over the past years in this increasingly divided nation? And entering this season of politics that is already off to a pretty sad start in terms of the way that people are treating each other, the question is, do we just keep trying to learn how to talk to each other? Very important. Or as people of faith, what are we offering the world? What are we about as people of faith in the midst of divided times, of challenges in the larger society? And this conclusion of, and it's not profound, the conclusion of continuing to develop our faith and make our faith and our lives and who we are resilient, no matter what the outcomes of elections are. No matter what the oppression and challenges are, we are people of faith who continue to live in the way we've been called to live, no matter the circumstances. Doesn't mean we don't have agency, but it does mean that our call is to become more faithful, more mature Christians. So we thought one of the ways to get at this idea of resiliency and faith building is not so much an intellectual enterprise, but perhaps through texts and through music and through the visual arts, through poetry. So going through the arts in a more evocative, emotional connection in developing our faith life, we thought this might be a way in, a different kind of way in. So this morning, Dr. Tim Beal, who is a Hebrew Bible scholar and a religion professor at Case Western Reserve University, will lead us off looking at the text in our own faith tradition, particularly looking at the Psalms, but looking at where lamentation and lament and complaint already reside in our own faith tradition, if we take a look. And a look more closely. So Tim is going to lead us through some texts, and I might say I think he's always very engaging, and I always learn a lot. So I'm just so glad that he is willing to. He really doesn't have an option, but he is willing. He is willing to bring his talents to Denver and Montview Church. All right, so join me in welcoming Tim, and bless you for being here.
Thank you, everybody. Good to see you. Good to be back and getting going on the new year and worship and adult education and formation and all of that. So yeah, as Clover said, What I'm trying to offer here is, are you hearing me okay? Really? Okay. It sounds loud up here. It's funny. Maybe it's like a feed. Maybe it's one of those or something. I don't know. Okay. To offer some resources and some thoughts about as Clover said, the biblical resources we have around the art of lament. And part of what I hope that we can talk about and think about today is the ways in which grief and pain and suffering are given form. They're not just emotions. And when we think about them in the context of a religious community, we're thinking about, we're talking about ritual, we're talking about the words, we're talking about how, when, and where they are performed. All of the Psalms were sung in an original ritual context, and we'll talk more about that. So really want you to think about the relationship between lament, grief, pain, suffering on the one hand, and form, and how the formfulness of lament is related to making lament sacred in some way, creating sacred space for giving voice, embodying pain and suffering and grief in a ritual context that actually makes that embodiment, that giving voice to, sacred, set apart, holy in all those ways. So we will zoom around in this Prezi. This is one of my favorite etchings by Leonard Baskin. He did a lot of woodcuts and some etchings and some watercolors. It's called Betrayal. A lot of the Psalms of complaint are about having been betrayed by somebody and the anger related to that. So just a couple thoughts about lament to get us going. Lament, I think of lament as an embodiment of grief. And by embodiment, I mean not just a giving voice to, but also an enacting with our bodies, in our bodies, with other bodies. It's more than just speaking and more than just singing. And again, as I just sort of suggested, it's giving sacred, in this context, it's giving sacred form or sacred shape. It's shaping it in a way that makes it set apart and holy. It's doing that for pain and suffering, which is something that we don't really find much in secular contexts outside of religious contexts. So there's something that we have to offer there as well that I'd like to reflect with you on. So just thinking about grief and hope together, we'll say this a lot, there's no hope without grief. Hope without grief maybe is something more like optimism. It tends to be fairly shallow and fairly cheap, and hope is deeper and more costly. I'm shaped very much by Walter Brueggemann's idea of reality, grief, and hope, and he talks about that in a very early book, The Prophetic Imagination, and then in a fairly more, like maybe 10 years ago now, one just called Reality, Grief, Hope, where he kind of lays it out a little more schematically and in a way that's easier for lay people to understand. And in that context, he's talking about how, the empire is putting forward ideology, let's say Israelite exceptionalism or American exceptionalism or Christian exceptionalism, and what the prophet confronts that ideology with is reality. Babylon's coming, for example. Look at the oppressive ways you are treating and marginalizing your own people. That's reality over against ideology. And then when the empire goes from ideology to denial, denying what's happening, the prophet confronts the empire's denial with grief, gives voice to grief in very powerful, powerful ways. And he's talking about the prophets, but we can talk about this with regard to the Psalms and other texts as well. And then when the empire's denial turns inevitably to despair, to sort of the world crumbling around our feet or out from under us in some sense, the prophet then actually offers hope. But you can't get to hope without going through grief. And that's why I think that's such a valuable way to think of it. I think in some ways, though, and the reason I put the little arrows both directions, is that it's not really an arc that just goes from reality to grief to hope. We're not on a pathway. There's a back and forth and an interaction among all of these different experiences and these different expressions. So we can think about it in a more complicated way as sort of moving around and among different things, and sometimes feeling two or three of them at the same time. As I said, I want to talk about hope over against optimism. Hope and optimism, I would like to suggest we think about differently. Hope is costly. Hope is deep. Optimism is cheap, a cheap high, and it's shallow, and it tends to crash into despair fairly quickly. And I think many of us ride these cycles of optimism and despair, even day to day or hour to hour sometimes these days. I'm thinking of politics right now, but we could talk about climate crisis or social justice or all kinds of other things. And so thinking about a deep and costly hope, and that connection of that to grief. And I also, though, want to say that grief is not a means to an end. That's the risk when you say there's no hope without grief. And I can't remember exactly how my class session was titled today, but it almost sounded like we've got to grieve in order to get to hope, as though it's sort of the thing we do in order to get to where we really want to be. And I want to suggest to you that experiencing grief, giving voice to grief, giving voice to pain and suffering is important in and of itself. It is not a means to an end. It is something that has to happen wherever you are and however you find your way to hope. It is important in and of itself to give voice to grief. And despair, I just want to say a little bit about despair, because so this is from, some of you probably know the writing of Elizabeth Colbert, who wrote the Sixth Extinction, and she has a newer one on engineering and all the sort of unexpected outcomes of the ways we try to problem solve as engineers. And she wrote this little piece. She has a new one called H is for Hope. She wrote a little piece in the New Yorker called Climate Change from A to Z, and it was an alphabet, and she had a little comment for a reflection on each of the letters, except for D. And all D got was, D is for despair. Despair is unproductive. It's also a sin. And that bothered me. I don't think there's any shame, let alone sin, in despair. I think despair, in many ways, is a very understandable and totally legitimate response to failed optimism. A lot of my students, and probably a lot of us, feel ashamed of our despair when we feel despair. Feel like it's wrong. We can't do that. We got to keep our heads up and, keep moving forward and all of that. And I just want to suggest that despair is okay and is an understandable response to a lot of what we experience, and especially to those moments when optimism sort of crashes, and we need to think into that experience too. So that is a little bit about that. Holy formfulness. I just finished this Prezi point. It's not a PowerPoint. I just finished this Prezi like at about 5 till 9, and that came to me right as I was wrapping it up. So maybe by the end I'll want to change it again. But holy formfulness, the way in which formfulness and form, especially in ritual contexts, relate to the sacred, to holiness, by which I mean set apartness, right? So I think that we can learn from traditional religious cultures, including the ancient Israelite and Judean religious cultures that we find in the Old Testament, in the Hebrew Scriptures, that these traditional cultures that understand the importance of letting suffering speak, of embodying suffering. And I don't know where my little quote went, but one of my favorite epigraphs I like to use when talking about this subject is one from a German Jewish philosopher Theodor Adorno, who was part of the Frankfurt School in the 40s, and the quote is, "To let suffering speak is the condition of all truth." To let suffering speak is the condition of all truth. Just put that at the top of everything you do and you say and you write. And it's a challenge, but and I think that in some sense, traditional religious cultures understand that. They understand that suffering is isolating, and there's a lot of research on the ways in which both physical pain and emotional suffering can be isolating for individuals. Elaine Scarry, whose name I refer to there at the end, argued in a book called The Body and Pain, and she was talking about physical pain, and especially torture, that bodily pain is, she said, language destroying. And insofar as language is how we make our world, construct a meaningful world for ourselves, pain is world destroying. And she talks a lot about how, I think by language she means communication, that pain, and we can generalize more broadly than physical pain here, I think, too, emotional, psychological pain as well. Just think about the ways we try to communicate it to someone who's not feeling it, right? It's like a hammer hitting it's all analogies. We basically, pain reduces us to cries and sighs, and there's no language for it. So that's why suffering is isolating, why it isolates us. We can't communicate it. We feel separated from others, even when they're trying to care for us, and is potentially world-destroying in that way as well. And therefore, letting suffering speak cannot be left to individuals. If they're already feeling that kind of isolation in that experience of suffering, and then you're encouraging them to grieve or encouraging them to, feel what they're feeling or whatever it is, they're already completely isolated. And finding ways to give speech to suffering, I think traditional religious cultures understand, means that they can't be left to themselves to do that the culture needs to offer words and ways and contexts and times to do that. We need cultural forms, words, actions, times, and places that are ritually constructed and maintained by community. And this makes me think about, as I just said a minute ago, the sort of connection between formfulness and sacredness. These shared forms that we collectively create and maintain through our ritual practices and so forth are literally sacred. The literal meaning of sacred doesn't have anything to do with God necessarily, doesn't have anything to do with the transcendent necessarily, doesn't even have anything to do with purity or anything like that. Sacred literally means set apart. The Latin sacer that it goes back to means set apart. And I'm really being informed here by a scholar of religion named Emil Durkheim. Some of you might know that name. He's considered also the father of sociology. But Durkheim basically described religion as a set, a kind of systematic collection of beliefs and practices relative to sacred things that are there, that is to say, beliefs and practices that set certain things apart, certain times, places, and things apart, and that insofar as the community collectively agrees to those beliefs and practices, and shares those, for example, ritual traditions, that's what makes them a community. It's kind of the social function, the sociological function of religion, is we all agree on these sacred things, places, and times, and in so doing, we become the church in some fundamental way. And so thinking about giving form and shape to grief, pain, and suffering through lament and complaint in the Psalms, this is ritual practice that is connecting the formfulness of lament and complaint to the sacredness of it, right? So I hope that makes sense, and we can definitely talk more about that. So, moving on into the Psalms and talking about them a little bit, we can think of, sometimes people say that the Psalms are ancient Israel's hymn book. I think maybe a better way to think of it would be the Book of Common Prayer. Some of you know the Book of Common Prayer from the Episcopal Church or the Anglican Church, which is basically a collection of various kinds of prayers and words for different occasions, different times, different places, and so forth. We can think of the Psalms as something like that, and I say, and other biblical poetry, because we find Psalms, which are songs, which are poems, all over the Hebrew Bible. And you can tell sometimes, we'll look at one toward the end from the book of Jonah, you can tell it had a ritual context before it became part of a particular narrative in which it appears now. So we can talk about, outside of the Psalms, biblical poetry as well. But sort of like a Book of Common Prayer for ancient Israel, all we have left are the words, right? In the words, we have a few clues about what it might have looked like and sounded like if we had been in an ancient Near Eastern context where these psalms were embodied. But not very much, and so we'll talk a little bit about that. The challenge then, when you're reading these psalms and remembering that these are all part of rituals that are mostly lost to us, ritual contexts that are mostly lost to us, the challenge is to try to reconstruct, this is a fancy German word because all the scholars who were working on the Psalms in the 19th century were German, but Gunkel used this phrase, Sitz im Leben, and it just means situation in life. So if I weren't trying to be such a show-off, I should have just put situation in life. But this is a little shorter, and it fit on my circle a little bit better. But trying to reconstruct the situation in life where these different texts would have lived and moved and had their being. I think one of the things that's really, really obvious and important to keep in mind is that the context for all of them would have been a communal ritual context. They would have been embodied in collective contexts. People didn't have Bibles next to their beds or in the morning when they wake up for their prayers where they were reading Psalms to themselves. Texts were not read to oneself. Texts were actually, in this tradition and in most ancient traditions, sung. They were canted. They were sung in a sort of metered, melodic sort of way. So all of these would have been sung in different ways, shapes, and forms, and would have been used in a communal context, not an individual context in that ancient world. 3 different main kinds of psalms in the book of Psalms. And there are some other kind of stragglers that don't quite fit these, but this is the general group of 3. There are psalms of praise, sometimes called hymns of praise. And then there are, which you know a number of those, I'm sure, and we can look at some if you like, but we're not focusing on those today. But those are hymns of praise to God, and they tend to sort of convey an experience that everything is right with the world, that creation makes sense, that God is present and is delivering and is saving, and all of that sort of that sense of orientation, which I'll get to in a minute. Second kind, we tend to call them psalms of complaint these days. They used to be categorized more often as psalms of lament, but I'm just going to use those words mostly interchangeably here. Psalms of complaint, which are going to be our main focus. And then third, psalms of thanksgiving. Say psalms of thanksgiving 5 times fast. Psalms of thanksgiving. And those are psalms where a psalmist, whether an individual or a collective, remembers a time when they cried out in complaint, in lament, and remembers being delivered from that, and is now praising God for that deliverance. So they often remember the pain and the suffering in very visceral, powerful ways as well. We can think about these also in terms of, hymns of praise as psalms of orientation. Everything makes sense, is oriented, structured. The whole cosmos is clicking and working, and I'm where I should be in it, and all of that. Psalms of complaint and lament are psalms of disorientation, when that feeling of sense and order and meaning and stability falls apart, falls out from under us, or crumbles under our feet, an experience of chaos and disorientation. And psalms of lament and complaint are giving voice to that. And then the third kind, psalms of thanksgiving, where they remember that disorientation, but have been delivered and have a new sense. It's not just back to orientation again. Walter Brueggemann wants to make clear that this is a new orientation, that you've been changed by the pain and suffering you've been through in your communal context, and you're different now. It's a new orientation, maybe hopefully one that integrates pain and suffering and the things that don't fit, so that we are more open to those things when we encounter them in others and in other people's experiences. So our main focus today is Psalms of Complaint. Now I'm going to just talk a little bit about those in particular. So Psalms of Complaint, also known as Psalms of Lament or Disorientation. Some basic things about the form of them, and they pretty much all have something close to this form, but the poet, or the collective poets, we don't know how these were written, but or memorized or whatever, but they will play with these forms, right? So form is important, and playing with form is also important. So we'll see all kinds of ways in which, working within these parameters, there's a lot of creativity that happens. But three main things for a psalm of complaint. First, it's addressed to you, that is, to God. In the second person singular. Second, it is giving voice to a complaint. Something's wrong. It could be physical harm, suffering, sickness. It could be, back to betrayal, the title of that.
My mic went out, hold on.
Oh, okay. Oh, goodness. Wow. It's really, the sound it must be something related to the performance, because I cannot tell if I'm projecting well enough or not. It all sounds loud up here to me, so sorry about that. Did you hear about the form, the three parts? Okay. So those are the main three parts. You've got it's addressed to a you, God. It's giving voice to a complaint, whatever it is that's wrong. The Babylonians are attacking. I'm sick, I can't eat, I'm depressed, we're, desperate, or whatever it is. And then the giving voice to a petition. Do this for us, for me. An address to the you, petitioning God to act. Oftentimes along with, where are you, why are you not here? Kind of an experience of divine absence. There are a few other things that will sometimes show up in Psalms of Complaint. So oftentimes you'll also get an expression of trust. That is to say, after the petition or somewhere in there, I'm doing this because I know you're going to respond, you're going to hear, you're going to deliver. And they will sometimes even remember times past when God has heard the cry of the people and has delivered them from their suffering or their experience. So an expression of trust that I'm talking to you because you're the one who can do something about it, and I know you will. And then also sometimes, maybe a little bit less frequently, language of motivation. And this is interesting, right? Because basically it's the psalmist or the collectives saying the psalm, trying to motivate God to action, either by, if you do this, I will make a sacrifice, I will praise you to my enemies, or if you don't do this, look what this is going to be how you look. This is not going to look good on you. Right? And, an example of that I was just thinking of just now is when Moses and God are arguing, when Moses is up on the mountain with God, and God wants to wipe out the Israelite people, the Hebrew people, because they've just made the golden calf, and he's saying, I'm going to go wipe out your people, I'm sick of them, and I'll start over with you, that kind of thing. And then Abraham says, don't do that, and gives some motivations. What would the Egyptians think? I mean, some of the motivations are like, you promised. You promised to Abraham and to Abraham's descendants, but also, what would the Egyptians think if you deliver your people out into the desert to die? That's not a good look. So oftentimes there is a kind of, potential shaming of God if God doesn't do what the psalmist wants, which is just really fascinating to think about. That is giving form in ritual to a very bold voice from an individual or a collective to God that is, provocative. And I don't think we have a lot of that in our particular liturgical traditions, but it's fascinating that you have this running through biblical tradition. Arguing with God, playing chicken with God, trying to motivate God through fear of shaming, so on. These can be in first person singular or first person plural, I or we. So let's look at a few of them. And I think, for sake of time, we don't have a ton of, we're just going to read through them. We probably won't have time for Q&A this time. But so this is a very kind of a nice one to start with, Psalm 6, for thinking about the form. And you can see all of those parts that I just was talking about. And so I'm just going to read it. O Lord, do not rebuke me in your anger or discipline me in your wrath. Be gracious to me, O Lord, for I am languishing, O Lord. Heal me, for my bones are shaking with terror. My soul also is struck with terror. While you, O Lord, how long? Turn, O Lord, save my life. Deliver me for the sake of your steadfast love. For in death there is no remembrance of you. In Sheol, who can give you praise? I am weary with my moaning. Every night I flood my bed with tears. I drench my couch with weeping. My eyes waste away because of grief. They grow weak because of all my foes. Depart from me, all you workers of evil, for the Lord has heard the sound of my weeping. The Lord has heard my supplication. The Lord accepts my prayer. All my enemies shall be ashamed and struck with terror. They shall turn back and in a moment be put to shame. So you see the parts. It's addressed to you, God. It is complaint, an expression of complaint, giving voice to the suffering. It's general in a way that makes it open for others to use the same language, and yet it's very much embodied, and I should have said that earlier. The poetry in the Psalms and throughout the Hebrew Bible is very bodily language. It's not just figurative, right? My bones are shaking. My bed is soaked. My couch is soaked. And that's a kind of parallelism there where it's said in two different ways. My eyes waste away. So you've got the complaint. You've got the petition. Turn, O Lord, save my life, deliver me. And you've also got a little motivation. Is it going to do you any good if I'm in Sheol, if I'm dead? I can't praise you there, right? Clearly not any sort of concept of an afterlife in this particular psalm either, something to think about. And then, of course, the last few lines there, an expression of trust that God will deliver this singular I. This is, to me, the most powerful psalm in the book of Psalms. There is no expression of trust. Toward the end of it, it really ends in a very dark place. It's kind of hard to read sometimes, but I'm just going to read this too. And again, just pay attention to all the very bodily, I don't want to say embodied language, but language of the body, in that sense, right? O Lord, God of my salvation, when at night I cry in your presence, let my prayer come before you. Incline your ear to my cry, for my soul is full of troubles, and my life draws near to Sheol. I am counted among those who go down to the pit. I am like those who have no help, like those forsaken among the dead, like the slain that lie in the grave, like those whom you remember no more, for they are cut off from your hand. You have put me in the depths of the pit, in the regions dark and deep. Your wrath lies heavy upon me, and you overwhelm me with all your waves. You have caused my companions to shun me. You have made me a thing of horror to them. I am shut in so that I cannot escape. My eye grows dim through sorrow. Every day I call on you, O Lord. I spread out my hands to you. Do you work wonders for the dead? Do the shades rise up to praise you? Is your steadfast love declared in the grave, or your faithfulness in Abaddon? Are your wonders known in the darkness, or your saving help in the land of forgetfulness? But I, O Lord, cry to you. In the morning my prayer comes before you. O Lord, why do you cast me off? Why do you hide your face from me? Wretched and close to death from my youth up, I suffer your terrors. I am desperate. Your wrath has swept over me. Your dread assaults destroy me. They surround me like a flood all day long. From all sides they close in on me. You have caused friend and neighbor to shun me. My companions are in darkness. Talk about suffering being isolating, right? I mean, this is just a very, very powerful expression of that. And there is the motivational language in there. Again, are they going to praise? Are the dead going to praise you? I can if I will if I can. That sort of thing. Also, just the language of assault and violence, and the way in which this voice is understanding all of their suffering as authored by God, as inflicted by God. Maybe that's motivational language for God to not want it to feel that way or to be that way, but it's a very powerful sort of theological language that we're looking at here. Psalm 22, I won't go all the way through this. Some of you know this psalm because it has, Jesus quotes it from the cross in the Gospels. My God, why have you forsaken me? Why are you so far from helping me? From the words of my groaning, oh my God, I cry by day, but you do not answer, and by night, but find no rest. What's interesting about this one is that it's an example of a lament psalm that seems to have something happen in the middle of it, because it switches from complaint suddenly to having been delivered, right in the middle of the psalm. And there's a theory about how this might have functioned in a ritual context that was first put forward by another German scholar, Sigmund Mowinckel. And the hypothesis is that there was another piece of the liturgy that we're calling a salvation oracle. And partly we call it that because when you look in the prophets, in many places in the prophets, you have these oracles from God that the prophet delivers that promises salvation, that promises deliverance. So we know that that's another form of poetry. And the hypothesis is that one or a collective would be reciting this psalm, canting it, and then there would be a pause and another voice coming in from another direction would offer a salvation oracle, some word of healing, of promise or deliverance. And then there's a turn after that to thankfulness for having been delivered. I always think of that that beautiful song from the 80s. It was Peter Gabriel and Kate Bush, I think. Don't Give Up. And his voice is this voice of isolation and depression, and she keeps coming in with this, don't give up. But so I'm just going to jump to where I have the little red there where something happens. But you, O Lord, the dogs are all around me. My company of evildoers encircles me. My hands and feet have shriveled. I count all my bones. They stare and gloat over me. They divide my clothes among themselves. And for my clothing, they cast lots. But you, O Lord, do not be far away. O my help, come quickly to my aid. Deliver my soul from the sword, my life from the power of the dog. Great movie with that title, The Power of the Dog. Save me from the mouth of the lion. So that's the petition. And then right after that comes, from the horns of the wild oxen you have rescued me. I will tell of your name to my brothers and sisters in the midst of the congregation. I will praise you, for who fear the Lord, you who fear the Lord, praise him. And it goes on. The deliverance has happened at this point in the poem. And if you're just reading this one poem, you're thinking there's something we're missing, something that we don't maybe have in this. And the hypothesis is that there might have been a ritual back and forth with another voice offering some sort of word of hope or salvation or deliverance that then causes the turn. And maybe then it's a third voice, or maybe it's the same voice in that next part. So those are some psalms of complaint. Very quickly, just look at one example of a psalm of thanksgiving. Recall that that's not an imperative to you. The psalms of thanksgiving recall first an experience of disorientation or suffering. They tell of that place they were. They also then recall, I cried out to God in various ways, various language. And then they turn and they testify to having been delivered after that cry to God. And then they offer praise, oftentimes fulfilling the vow that they had made, that I will praise you if you deliver me, right? The shape of a psalm of thanksgiving, which is sort of, I was at rock bottom here, I cried out from that place of suffering, and you delivered me. That sort of shape there is all through the Hebrew Bible. And one core text in the Hebrew Bible that really sort of summarizes that in just a couple verses is in Exodus 2. And it's when the Hebrew people are enslaved in Egypt and being oppressed, and all of this language of them groaning and crying, and they cry out in their suffering, and their voice comes up to God, and God hears their voice, remembers the promises God had made to the ancestors, and chooses to deliver and save them, which is what leads to the Exodus story. What that suggests is that the voice of pain, that letting suffering speak, actually is necessary in order to wake God up, in order to motivate God to act, in order to make God remember, right? This is a different sort of theology than the kind that we're shaped by, in Greek philosophical sorts of language, omniscient, omnipresent, omnipotent, and all. None of those omnis here, right? But a very powerful relationship in which the voice of pain can move God. So this is one psalm of thanksgiving from the book of Jonah. You know the one where Jonah, that's a picture, an old medieval picture of Jonah. He's getting delivered by an angel and spit up by the fish at this particular moment. He's got some pretty cool tattoos. So I'm just going to read it, and you'll see exactly what I just described in terms of the form of the Thanksgiving psalm. I called to the Lord out of my distress, and he answered me. Out of the belly of Sheol I cried, and you heard my voice. You cast me into the deep, into the heart of the seas, and the floods surrounded me. All your waves and your billows passed over me. By the way, he's in the fish when he's singing this psalm. Then I said, I am driven away from your sight. How shall I look again upon your holy temple? The waters closed over me. The deep surrounded me. Weeds were wrapped around my head. At the roots of the mountains, I went down to the land whose bars closed upon me forever. Yet you brought up my life from the pit, O Lord my God. As my life was ebbing away, I remembered the Lord, and my prayer came to you into your holy temple. Those who worship vain idols forsake their true loyalty, but I, with the voice of thanksgiving, will sacrifice to you, and I have vowed, what I have vowed, I will pay. Deliverance belongs to the Lord. Fascinating, right? That what Jonah does inside the fish is sing this psalm, and somehow that provokes the fish to spit him back up. It provokes another deliverance. It's just really interesting. If we had more time, we could talk a lot more about that. So those are a few examples of psalms of complaint and one of psalms of thanksgiving. And just a couple quick takeaways before we go. We have something very special here that we have inherited, and I think that we don't really take it seriously. We don't sometimes accept what we've inherited, I think, in some ways. We've inherited these words and also some traces of how they've been ritually embodied in the past. And the question I would like for us to be thinking about as we think about lament in music and lament in poetry and lament in visual arts and in these different forms, the different forms that lament and grief and pain and suffering are given, is how can we draw these inheritances out and embody them in our own lives as individuals and as community. I made clear early on that the original context was communal and collective, but that doesn't mean that's the only way that we can use these psalms. How can we bring them to life in new ways on new horizons? And just two very simple suggestions. First, just to say them, just to pray them in new contexts, whether collectively or individually, not just the ones that are in our lectionary, our collection of texts that are read, during worship services, but all of these other ones like Psalm 88. Part of what we have is we're given words, we're given language, and sometimes that's what we need when we're in an experience of pain and suffering. Back to the isolation, back to the language-destroying power of pain and suffering. This offers us something that we can just say, right? So that's one very simple suggestion. And the other is maybe to play a little bit with the forms. You know a little bit about those forms now. I'm happy to share this or some way so you can go back and look at them again. But to play with the forms, and this is an idea I'm taking from Padraig Otuma, who's going to be with us via Zoom next week or October 7th. And Padraig has done this really beautiful thing with a form that's in the Book of Common Prayer and in a lot of traditional Christian liturgy called the collect. And it's a very simple form, and, O God, for whom no secrets are hid, and you just sort of, you address and then unpack and then ask and then unpack. And he has played with that form with people in creative writing workshops. He's done it himself in a little book of collects that he wrote for a community that he was part of. And I'm just starting to think about whether there are ways we could do that with some of these other forms of biblical poetry as well, including psalms of lament and psalms of thanksgiving too, to just sort of set up a little structure for yourself and start writing. Or if that's a little too intimidating, one little trick I have in my own writing is that I will take something I really admire, a poem or a paragraph or something like that, and I'll literally rewrite it word for word through the whole entire thing, so that what you end up with is something with a little bit of the same rhythms and structures, but a completely different text. And it can be fun to do that. Like, try that with Psalm 6, right? A very short lament psalm. Just try moving through it and sort of translating or using completely different language, but replacing as you go, and just see what you end up with and then go from there. Just little ideas like that. Writers are great for, tricks and little things to try. And so that's just another suggestion, to play with these forms and, just to take seriously what we have inherited. words and the structures that that we have at hand. We don't have to write our own new ones. We don't have to write our own, book about it or memoir or poem. We have this language that is ours to use and share and to encourage others to use and share collectively and individually. So that's, I feel like, a good place for us to end, and it's 25 after. Is that good? Yeah? Okay. Did that feel like a dangling ending or something? Did it feel like I was dangling there at the end, or do we have time for? And I can repeat them if we don't carry the mic around.
We're going to carry the mic around.
All right. Then we have time for one half of one question. Yeah, okay. I couldn't remember if it was 20 after or 30 after.
Did anyone raise their hand?
Yeah, thank you, Tim. One of the challenges, I think, that a group that sometimes calls itself the Frozen Chosen is how to truly embody, actually drop into our body, and both enabling the depth that you're speaking to, but also seeing that the lamentation will actually help us to cycle ever more deeply. And I'm really curious as to how something like this might happen, and we're really looking forward to it.
Yeah. Well, I mean, you're absolutely right. And for me too, I struggle with that. I think that's part of what I'm trying to sort of point to around the edges of these when I say there was a whole ritual context for these things. There were ways to sing them. There were ways to hold your body in certain contexts, or to move in certain ways, or to be in relation to other bodies in certain ways that we've lost. And I think sometimes, I'm just speaking for myself, but when we move in the direction of thinking about embodiment and that sort of thing in our contemporary context, sometimes it can feel like there's some sort of pressure to be creative with that, or to do something sort of innovative or something. And part of what I like about the value of ritual in that sense is that it gives us embodied actions, to follow, to copy, to imitate. And for some of us, that's easier. I just had this is a little bit of off that, but related, I think. I had a conversation with one of my master's students who is a therapist as well, mostly working with college students, and does a lot with horses as well. And she was talking about rocking, about the body rocking, and how humans and other animals do this. The repetitive rocking motion, it's often related to trauma, to pain, to suffering. And I was thinking about that and how many different contexts I can imagine in which there are ritual practices that involve rocking. I'm thinking right now of, canting passages as part of morning prayers and evening prayers and so forth like that. But that just came to mind while you were talking. But I totally agree. It's a challenge. I think sometimes too, yes. While Todd goes to, I think sometimes too, that's what's going on in contexts different from ours that are like youth group contexts, like Spirit of the little hand motions, are ways to do that are easy and that we can all do, and that don't make us feel like we need to be like good dancers or something like that.
Yes, I just wondered what you think with this in the context of history, that it seems like it's in human nature to be suffering and then feel isolated and want to reach out. And you know, you see in history countries, I'm thinking of Germany, where the Germans felt they were suffering and isolated, and then they turned to a leader who wasn't a good leader. And I see some of this in this country now, that this a sort of grievance that people are feeling and they're not heard and they're turning to a leader.
Yeah. That's really insightful to make that analogy between the individual suffering and in pain and isolated to a collective trauma, collective pain, collective suffering that leads to that kind of a response. And that's a very different response, isn't it, from what we have when we're looking at these lament psalms and complaint psalms, where we're being invited in that context to sit with the pain, and to be given some language and some ritual practice around it to be able to sit in the pain and with the pain and acknowledge it. Whereas I think what oftentimes, if you're talking, for example, about the Third Reich Germany, it's really an escape from the pain and the suffering, and it's much more like what we're talking about as optimism, right? And oftentimes, and thinking about today as well, you know, optimism and anger, optimism and rage can be a very powerful combination. Like, the reason is these people, and the reason for our problems is these people, and the way to, you know, make it great again is you know, through maybe even violence that is a weird kind of violent optimism. Really, really insightful point. That's probably it, right, Clove? Yeah.
Next week, Daryl Walker will be with us, who is the music director at Park Hill United Methodist Church. So we thank him for taking a break from his job to come over here and do our job. So he has worked with the Spirituals Project, and so he's going to talk about, he and Adam Waite will have a conversation around how music has been used and is used for a vehicle, a way of creating language around lament. So next week it will be the music part of this, focusing on spirituals. And then the next week, our own Sandy Prouty will work on, or will address the lament in the visual arts and how the visual arts art has helped us lament. And then, as Tim mentioned, poet Padraig Tuma, if you know him from his podcast, Poetry Unbound, and he has many collections of poetry. He's Irish, and we've had the privilege of getting to know him some, so he's going to zoom in for us and talk about poetry and the process of lament.